Okay, so I'm going to wrap up the meeting with a few comments, and then we'll go into the community discussion. I'm sure it's all clear to all of you, but putting on a meeting like this is a lot of work, and so I want to give particular credit to these 5 people who were the chairs of the various committees that sort of made this all happen. In particular, this guy. Basically, so Thomas and Kendrick Kay kind of were the people who kind of had the idea to start this conference back in, I think the first email was like 2015 or something like that. It took a couple years to actually make it happen, and now we've had 3 meetings, and I think hopefully you'll all agree that they've all been increasingly successful, and this time very successful. So first I'd like you to join me in giving a hand to all of them. Okay, that thing won't stop going, so I'm going to do this. This is the problem with visual effects. So there's a lot of other people involved as well, and so we'd like to thank them also for their contributions, and I'll kind of point out a couple of them as we go along. And obviously, a meeting like this takes money as well. In addition to the money that you all pay to be here, we go out and try to get other people to help us, pay for the venue and the cost of the speakers and all that. So, also want to thank. I know we have representatives from various of these groups in the audience. So, join me in giving them a hand as well. And so finally, if it wasn't clear to you, there's also a set of people who we pay to help make the meeting happen. This is Conference Management Services, and in particular, Alex, who you may have seen out at the desk out there, has really been our person on the ground here for the last few months, just making all of this happen. And so I want to thank them as well. So this is a breakdown of who we are, at least in terms of the registrants. Pretty heavily U.S.-centric, but a large contingent from Europe as well. Germany, UK, Netherlands all have at least 25 people here, and then a long tail of other places that people are coming from. We ask about gender. We want to know how well we're doing with balance. Clearly, we have some work to do where it's hard to know what the prefer not to answer means. I know there's some countries where it's actually illegal to answer or ask that question. So nonetheless, I think we would like to move towards greater diversity of all types in the meeting, including gender. So what about the papers? We had 342 submissions. We accepted about 91% of those. And 920 unique authors, so a lot of authors who didn't actually come to the meeting. Most authors had just 1 abstract, and most abstracts had about 3 authors. You can't see much here other than, so this is a authorship network, and I just want to make one point, which you can get from the gestalt of this. So often, if you look at scientific literatures and you do this kind of analysis, where every edge here, every little piece of text that you can't read is a person, a unique person, and every edge means that those people were a co-author on at least 1 abstract. If the edges are thicker, that means they were co-authors on multiple abstracts. And so the point here is that we have a lot of really separate communities. In some areas, if you look, you see there's a huge, giant component with, like half of the authors all kind of working together. And I think, you can view this as glass half full or glass half empty. I think it actually suggests that, we've got a bunch of people who are still working in different areas, and we have yet to kind of really come together and start publishing together, suggests that there's room to move. But nonetheless, even within this, there are sets of people who are starting to collaborate with one another, and you start to see multiple papers within some of these groups. It'll be interesting to look at where that goes in the future. I took the abstracts and ran a topic model just to kind of get a rough feel for what are the things that abstracts are about here. And some of the topics are kind of these big, broad, obvious ones like models and tasks. But the interesting thing is you start to see topics popping out that really relate to many of the different talks that we see. Things about just the last one, visual faces and objects, learning and uncertainty, decision and bias, memory representation hippocampus, auditory stimulus feature. So it shows really the breadth of the meeting in terms of the types of topics that are popping out. We aren't just about one thing. We're about a lot of different topics, with the thing that's kind of common is the set of the kinds of sort of integration of methods and tools that we're using. I don't think this meeting's been around long enough for it to be anybody's sort of central meeting yet, other than Thomas, because he doesn't have time to do anything else. But so most of you probably go to at least one of these other meetings, if not others that I happen to leave out. But I think that what we've done is actually done a really good job of bringing in speakers, both speakers and abstracts, from people who would sort of view all of these other meetings as their main meeting, with the exception, I think, I don't think we have a lot of abstracts from people who would have NeurIPS as their main conference, who would consider themselves like really hardcore machine learning researchers, and we can have a discussion about whether that's something we want to, kind of reach out to. And maybe I'm misreading. Maybe there's some of you here who think that you are that person, and if so, that's great. And we want to hear how to get more of your colleagues engaged. Nonetheless, I think that there's people in this room for whom at least one of these conferences is your main conference. So I think that we're kind of tiling the space pretty nicely. And the goal is to not necessarily make this the only conference people would go to, because I think you're also many people are also going to want to be sort of going to the more focused conferences, but nonetheless, we want it to be kind of a central meeting, something that you will keep coming to. So we had a bunch of keynotes that, again, kind of span that space, and I'm not going to try to give you an overview of what the keynotes were about, because Natalia Velez has actually done an amazing job of this. If you go to her Twitter feed, you can see some of her sketches of the different talks. And they really kind of distill the ideas that come out of those talks, so I'd recommend that you go check those out. When we were thinking about developing CCN back in 2015, 2016, we wanted it to be something beyond just coming and sitting and listening to a bunch of talks. Other conferences do that, and we wanted to have something more. So we try to think up what are the things we can do to actually have people engage on a more personal level and on a more sort of active level in kind of talking about science and getting to know each other. So the first thing that we've done that I think has been pretty successful is mind matching. I solicited comments on Twitter, and most people said, "Hey, it was great. The room was too small and too loud," and they also said, we need to figure out something to do about when people don't actually show up. Nonetheless, I think overall the reception to mind matching, and hopefully, many of you would agree with this, that, you sort of got to know people you didn't know before, learned about people working on similar questions whose work you weren't familiar with, and hopefully we'll walk out of here with social connections with those people such that our authorship graph will start to, kind of conglomerate into a larger, giant component. The cross-collaboration breakouts, obviously, we had lots of different topics people were talking about. This is one that I was in yesterday about cognitive tasks, which was really fun. I got to know a grad student from another lab who I hadn't met, who was working on, very similar topics to things that I think about. And I think it was a really fun discussion, kind of inspired a number of thoughts, including some of the thoughts I'll mention in a moment. We've tried twice in a row now to inspire controversy and conflict and debate. And so this year it was the Battle of Bayes in Berlin, which turned out to be Bayesian bros hugging it out. It's really hard to get people to fight on stage. And so we'll continue to try, I think, but we'll probably fail like we failed in the last 2 years. But nonetheless, I think it was a really great, hopefully you enjoyed the discussion. It's really great to see people, kind of digging into these ideas. So I just tried to think about what are some of the themes that I saw in the talks that I went to and the posters and various things. And I think one that popped out to me is like really taking seriously the complexity both of behavioral performance sorts of signals and of brain signals. So we saw in Ann Churchland's talk, the complexity of behavior, even non-instructed behavior. We saw in Nathaniel's talk this morning the complexity of dopamine signaling and trying to understand, what on earth are dopamine neurons responding to. And then I think we also see this need to basically build tasks that are actually sufficient to distinguish models. So we saw in Mate's talk this morning, building a set of tasks specifically to be able to pull apart this particular classes of models. The other thing that I've started to sense is, and particularly in things like Bernard's talk yesterday, is the need to go beyond simple associative learning, right? The need for generative models, causal models, the idea that simply just storing a bunch of associations in a relatively model-free way is not going to get us where we want to be. And then also thinking about how really simple mechanisms, and I didn't have time to add your talk, but it's another one that did a nice job of this, how really simple mechanisms can potentially give rise to the kind of structured representations that we see either in the mind or the brain. What do I hope changes for next year? I hope that we've already had some of this, but I hope we have a continued focus and a greater focus on richer behavioral measures and richer neural measures. So for example, a lot of times when we see a neural network being assessed, we see accuracy on a task, right? And I think that static accuracy on a single task is just not enough to tell us what we need to know. If you look at you look in psychological papers, you're often looking in very detailed ways at particular aspects of behavior. So I think we need to kind of dig in, both on the neural side and the behavioral side, and also start to look at dynamics. We saw in Mate's talk today, sort of actually modeling of neural dynamics, of oscillations. And it's easy to forget that the brain is a complex dynamical system. It's also easy to forget that it runs on about 20 watts of power. And those are things that I think we have to take seriously if we want to actually do a good job of modeling brains. I think we need to think about how to start to use much larger sets of tasks. Everybody has their favorite zoo. I think we need to start thinking about task zoos. And there was some discussion of this in our breakout yesterday. And then finally, I think we need to, again, inspired by yesterday's discussion, we need to start thinking about what's the space of tasks? Like we evolved to do things in the world, and like in the vision community, you've started to gain a pretty good understanding of like what are the things that the visual system was evolved to do. I think we don't really understand kind of what the eigentasks are for sort of more cognitive types of functions. So I hope that we can spend more time in the future kind of thinking through those questions. CCN will be in San Francisco next year. We have dates. We don't have a location yet, but we hope to nail that soon. So obviously there will be great science. There will be amazing food. If you like hiking, there will be that. And if you enjoy recreational psychopharmacology, it is now legal in San Francisco, so you can enjoy some of that as well. Another thing that I just want to highlight, because if you want to be involved in this, you need to start thinking about it soon, is that we'll have a session about this Algonauts project, which is a contest for decoding of large-scale data. The data sets will come out in April. Submissions will be due in July, and then we'll have the session at CCN. So with that, I think we'll move on to the community meeting. So